Welcome to Inside the Numbers, the RockDaisy Sports Performance Podcast, where we decode the data, science, and stories powering elite athlete development. I'm Ron McKeefrey, and in every episode, I'll be diving deep with top strength conditioning coaches, sports scientists, and performance experts who are driving the game forward using tech, insight, and grit. Hey guys, welcome back to Inside the Numbers, powered by RockDaisy. I'm your host, Ron McKeefrey, and excited for this one. Got a longtime friend, Bob Alejo. Bob, there's very few people that come on this podcast that have been in it longer than me, but you've been in it longer than me, and we've been friends for long enough to where you call me Ronnie still. So like it's good to have you on.
Man, it's good to laugh on a Sunday morning. Yeah, me too. 40 years. I have a hard time telling people my age as I say, really, am I really that old? Like, holy but 40 strong years with a profession that I love and will promote it and probably until my last breath. But I'm happy to sit here on a Sunday morning and have a coffee and a chat with Ron McKeefrey.
It's good, buddy, man. We've been friends for a long time, 30 years in it, 40 years for you. And we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of this thing. And,
sure.
What if you were pointing to the one thing that you think is the biggest change in our industry from when we started to now, what would you say that is?
Ooh, that's a big one. Well, what has changed what we've done, not what necessarily has changed, is the onset of technology and data. Now, let me characterize that for everybody who doesn't have gray. Data was always big to us, right? We were always taking numbers. But what you can do now is you can take so many more numbers and get a little more insight into adaptation, into programming and all that, which I think is great, right? But oftentimes, that also leads to going down a rabbit hole, which we used to do with just, team position squat averages, like how's this happening? What's the whole deal? I think that you get busy trying to make that 1% gain and you're overlooking the 20, 30, 40, 50% gains that are right there sitting and staring you at the face. So, I think that's one of the things that has changed our profession of strength and conditioning. The other changes are happening in sport. Everybody wants things real fast, real now. Certainly the NIL has changed the characterization of timing for success, right? Right now we see baseball in the MLB, which I spent 16 years in. They're firing managers in April when there's 130 games left, as if, that you couldn't gather some momentum at some point, but that they want to win now. And it's looked like it's everywhere. And so when that happens, dynamics change in organizations and institutions. And as you and I talked about, there's not as much development going on because kids are in the portal and they're leaving and, you have to keep them there. And the program isn't like what we used to do, sports fans, is we used to say, here's Ron McKeefrey as a freshman out of such and such high school. Man, this guy's going to be a top-notch starter as a junior. Here's how we're going to do this and get this program of a stepping process to physical, mental, and skill set success. And that's gone. So I think, in some instances, especially with the high profile sports like football, men's, women's basketball, development is not looked at as much anymore because of how transient the rosters are. So I think those are probably the biggest two things as we speak today,
You said something there that I think is really important, is like you said that we've always tracked data. It's not new. It's not something that, that we were all of a sudden we're archaic because we didn't, we weren't there in the last 10 years. You are a true leader in this profession. Like you've done it from the very beginning in that way, both professionally and personally. Professionally, they've even made a movie about some of the work you guys did with the A's, and how advanced you were. How have you been able to, stay current with, whether it be technology or the latest trends or, and just really challenge yourself to kind of have that personal continuing education plan? Cause I've said this on the show a couple of times. Like I remember the computer lab going into my college, much less have your own personal computer.
And those stacks of cards you got to feed.
Yeah. We've seen it, but yet there are very many, we're talking off camera that there's a lot of coaches that I deal with that are significantly younger than you or I that don't know how to use a computer, that don't know how to, don't know technology. And they think because they work in a weight room They don't need to learn that stuff or be educated in different areas outside the four walls of that weight room. So how have you gone about like really challenging yourself to stay current with things? And what are some of the, maybe the tactical things that you do, whether it's reading every morning or getting on a podcast or things like that have helped you?
Well, you have to have a why, right? And my why for staying current is my family that lives in a house that has a mortgage, and I want my fridge to be full, and I want gas in my car, and I want lights to come on, I want hot water. That's honest to God, that's, got to be somebody's why back there. But the other part too is for the same reason you just talked about, I've talked to some people before, and whether it's pompous or otherwise, when they talk about oh, I don't need that stuff, and I've kept up with it. I've kept up with it to make sure that I am current because I want to be certain. And one thing we do know about the data, not the technology, because technology right now is like a toaster. That's all it is. You plug it in, you turn it on, and it does what you tell it to do. What comes out of it is what you've designed it to and asked it to bring you, and you have to be good at that, which is a whole nother subject. I don't think people are as good as everybody thinks they are. And the injuries and all this other stuff is proof of that. But I wanted to make sure I knew what I was doing and I went to the right people. One of the things, Ron, that I've done is smart enough to get smart people around me. I'm not afraid to make a phone call and text. I do it all the time. And that way I don't have to guess. I don't want to guess. So one of the things was being able to be more conclusive about what that vertical jump, what that 40-yard time or the 20-yard split means. What does the power clean, the speed of the bar, those things, those are important, and you got to put that down. I didn't want to be the last one to the party on that. But I do tell, like you said, there is people that don't know how to operate it, and don't understand it, and don't want to do it, and think that they can see it and all that. I'll tell you, now I'll take my 40 years and my baseball card and compare it to anybody's, but I'll tell them like, hey, listen, if I can't see the asymmetry in that vertical jump off of the right and the left leg coming back from a knee or an ankle, I know you sure in the hell can't. So you need to get on that. That's helpful. It's not that hard. And I tell you, man, when I jumped into catapult the first time, I thought I better get on this. And I thought I was just going to be jumping into this giant lab computer thing. And at the end of my first day with, his name was Hiwote Darris, who was working for Catapult. Now we such close friends now. He's with Connexon now.
Mm-hmm.
When he finished tutoring me in my office at North Carolina State, I said, "Is that it?" He said, "You can't believe how easy it is and how bad people are at doing it." I said, "Oh," I was like relieved, and then all of a sudden it becomes more fun. So yeah, no, data has been important to us. That's how we designed our programs back then with the limited amount of data that was available. And, with EAs, this whole data thing started off, I guess I could say I was there as the Red Sea of data parted, and and the angels were singing, "Whoa!" Here we go. But it's just actually looking for as much as you can. But that didn't stop us in baseball from taking ground balls and batting practice. You still got to do that.
That's right.
And I think you and I have found that it's so much easier now to get those numbers, but it appears to be difficult for many to put context to them. And I know you believe in this. You got to be able to speak and understand the sport, And so if you're a strength and conditioning coach and you don't understand the terminology of sport and what that means in strategies and skills and all that, you're going to have a difficult time. So I think it's the same thing with the data. If you don't really understand a soccer match and you look at running loads and speeds, you're not going to understand why that even happened.
Great.
And so it's it's a double-edged sword for sure. The data can help the team or it can hurt the team. That's where this thing's all at. So I like it. I enjoy diving deep into it and seeing it, but at the same time, I still think that, and Billy Bean will tell you the same thing, intuition still has to play a role somewhere in there, and common sense.
Well, I think that's what it does, right? It helps you take the subjectivity out, right? It makes it a little bit more objective, but it's not really changing, how you go about motivating that athlete to still become, the best athlete they can possibly be, and I agree with you. Like, out there, in college, there was 2 classes that I took that I was like, what am I taking these classes for? and I was a pretty good student, but I took a computer class where, of course, you had to learn to type and do all those types of things, right? And I took a German class, and
Really?
I had to take 2 years of German in college. Like, why am I taking German, right? And sure enough, the first NFL Europe, I go to Germany for 4 months, and
Wow.
and then I use, every time I see one of our athletes hunting and pecking on a keyboard, I'm thankful for that computer class, and so it's not always applicable in the moment, but learning how to learn, I think that's the key, right? Learning how to learn, and because you're not going to have all the answers, and you're definitely not going to have all your answers for your a 40-year career or a 30-year career, and you have to challenge yourself to continue to stay current, and motivation of keeping your job is that. But I think especially a lot of our, people in our profession think that that's vanity. As long as I look like a strength coach, I'll be okay in the weight room. But I mean, 30 and 40 years, I'm telling you what, you look a lot different later on, right?
Trust me. Trust me. I mean, I'll tell you, I had plenty of hair dryers and combs and brushes about 20, 30 years ago. Those are gone.
No doubt. Well, like I said at the beginning, we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, this profession, right? There's so many good things, and we're both a byproduct of that. And that's why we're so passionate about, staying active and continually trying to make it better. But there have been things where you're just shaking your head, and you're going, what are we doing? And where do you think that the profession's gone sideways maybe in the last 5-10 years?
I'm trying to put in the right word. I think what's happened is we have more opinions coming to us and more ideas from the outside in an unorganized fashion. It just happens. There's been instances where I and others, somebody say, hey, why don't you just do your job and I'll do mine. And I say, well, wait a minute now. I don't want to do your job, but I need you to do your job to help me. So that's why I'm coming to you, trainer, nutritionist, biomechanist, groundskeeper, whoever, you need to be on your game so that my game ends up fitting, right? And that's why, I'm such a advocate for the high performance model that, once you can get that model in place, now you have standardized policies and procedures, you have a shared communication and understanding of what we are doing, right? There's no gaps. And it's transdisciplinary, which is one team, instead of interdisciplinary, which is a team of teams. It's still siloed, and you can still talk, but if it's not formalized, then the communication lines are off. So, you have somebody, let's make it real simple, a 1, 2, 3 line of communication. One can't go to three. It's kind of a military thing, right? You got to go to two, and then two goes to three, and making it super simplified, but that's been a problem for strength and conditioning. And then sometimes, if you're not as supported as you should be, and we know that support varies from school to school, from team to team, from sport to sport, you just have to jump in line on your own to do, whatever. Well, I'm forced to do this. And it should never be that way. It should be one voice coming out of all those educated people who all know a little bit about what each other does. In other words, when we all go to school, trainer, therapist, even physicians, right? We all take about the same classes, and then it gets, it starts taking off into whatever. So we all understand these things, right? So what ends up happening is one example is you get somebody coming back from a knee or a lower body injury, and they're in athletic training or PT, and the lunge and squat they're doing would never be considered a lunge or squat in our room when they were healthy. So that's why we have to also standardize the language, so it's a squat until it's not a squat. Here's the criteria for that. There's no such thing as a strength squat or a rehab squat. It's either a squat or it's not. And then you got to change some of the language in the, understanding what the injury report means. So I don't think we've gone sideways on our own. We're certainly culpable of that. I mean, I think oftentimes we're our own biggest barrier. But at the same time, you got so much influence hitting you now of what you can do and how you can do it, because everybody thinks, I mean, hell, you can pick up Popular Mechanics magazine and there's some strength and conditioning columnist in there, so everybody knows something about it, right? Way more than we do. And so I think that's part of it. I think the glitz and the glamour of the job too is a lot more important to people than actually results. I think that there's a lot of showcasing going on, and I think there's a lot of showcasing going on of really good coaches too.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case, right? I still think that, the best of the best, they just do their job, and that's probably a more likely scenario. The other stuff is kind of, I think, making up for the fact that you may not be as good as other people or as good as you think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that. I was thinking of this, I was trying to think of my answer when I asked that question or listening to you. And I think probably the biggest thing that I'm disappointed in is that we were born out of a time where people thought that it was literally bad to lift weights for sport, right?
That's right.
This is
Yeah.
50 years ago, it's not that long ago. And so there was a lot of people that had an entrepreneurial spirit, that had kind of a band kind of brotherhood, sisterhood of making a profession out of nothing and actively seeking out opportunities to grow it and make it better. And I think we've lost that. I don't think there's enough
Yeah.
people that really are invested in trying to leave it better than they found it. And and that's evidenced by not having places for our aging strength coaches to go. It's evidenced by not creating anything additional, nothing really outside the box. The last thing that I can think of is tactical strength conditioning, where that was kind of, maybe a part where we kind of created opportunities, created jobs for strength coaches.
I would agree.
Or you were talking off camera, I think, just about like the safeguards committee and only having one representative from strength and conditioning on that committee. Or probably most obvious, I think, lately is they literally just changed the rules where there's no limit on football coaches, but yet we still have a 5 strength coach limit in the weight room.
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
And so like, why is that the case? It's one of the most riskiest places for athletes, to be. And yet we're going to take eyes away and limit the number of eyes there when everywhere else you can have as many as you want. Like, it doesn't make sense. Right. So like,
That's bad.
I think there's got to be some desire to want to improve it, make it better than you found it. And that starts with being involved and I've got news for you. Like, Bob is as educated as they come and puts out a ton of great information and gives back in a tons of ways and does podcasts and writes papers and does those things. I've written books and gotten multiple degrees and all. Like, you're not, as strength coaches, you're not the busiest people in the world. Like, stop.
Yeah.
Like, you can do more than just your job. And it is more than a full-time job. I get that, but it is, something that is a privilege. And, I think it requires everybody, because we're still in the first 100 years, to get to give back and try to make it better, and, there's all kinds of jobs that we can create. I've given this example before, but I talked to people on oil rigs and talking about putting a strength coach on oil rigs, and how dangerous that job is and how important fitness, and you can't just be hurt that day. Like,
Why?
so like,
Right.
I think there's all kinds of opportunities to grow the profession and keep good coaches in it, rather than them, burn the light out 10, 15 years into it and then decide to go, get a real job, I guess. Right. So
Right.
we have an
Right.
obligation to that. What do you think? Because we've seen it, a lot of different ways, and in some ways it's not changed at all, and in a lot of ways it's changed dramatically. What do you think the field looks like in 15 years?
Oh, gosh. Well, I hesitate to say this, but the trajectory is such, it's not going to look anything like it looks right now. Because right now it doesn't look anything like it did 10 years ago. I mean, so it's kind of I think there's going to be maybe one football conference collegiately. I think that Major League Baseball will probably have one minor league conference or league, because now we're seeing these kids getting drafted and going to the big leagues within 6 weeks, and so what does that say about development and where's that going to go? Right. Well, we know that if they're, like, for instance, you talked about football coaches now you can have a limitless whatever. Well, where do you think the money's going to come from? It's not going to come from athletic training. They have to treat injuries. It's a medical instance, right? That strength coaches, if they're not going to be reduced, their salary sure will be. And then what do you think that's going to be for the re-Olympic sports? I mean, the increase, I don't even know the last time. You'd have to take a look at it, but my guess is the overwhelming majority of Olympic sport programs have not added positions since this thing started. They're not going to get it. I know that the NIL is going to indirectly affect them, but that's just in the resources, and that resource is going to be money, and the money's going to go to salaries, and they're not going to get it. So it's kind of a sad looking thing after, gaining some momentum. I took a couple of notes while you were talking here, that the two things that I agree about that you talked about is the camaraderie. We would fly in UCLA in the Pac-10 back then. We'd fly in and have dinner with the opposing coach Friday night, and probably stay out a little bit longer than we should have, and then showed up at the 50-yard line at noon the next morning, happy as hell, and then after the game going to go. I don't think that happens anymore. I know in baseball we used to do it all the time. I mean, I barely met anybody in the last 2 years with the Angels. It's just why, and somebody's got to be in the weight room, and somebody's got to do this, and then I don't know why that is. They meet once a year. There's no reason for that. They're not really bringing each other up, and so that's part of it. When you talk about the beginning of the whole thing, in '93, when I was the first strength coach in Oakland A's history, Major League Baseball still didn't have a director of strength and conditioning at every team full time. Some would just be there at home who owned a local gym. And then when the team went on the road, there was nobody going with them, right? Certainly no
Right.
nutritionists and all that. So the evolution, it happened and it continued. And now I don't know if it's going to continue. I mean, I don't know how that's going to happen. There seems to be so much confusion as to what sports science is. We haven't really pinned that down yet. And so now we're seeing those positions holding higher positions than strength coaches administratively in some areas. And not to say that that couldn't happen, but it shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
They have a very finite look at what strength and conditioning is doing. So I don't have a dim look at it. I just don't think there's going to be much progress. I think you just got to hold on. And I think to your point too, it's, nobody's really pushing forward for the profession. I mean, I think they're all pushing forward for themselves. And pretty soon that's going to be a waste because the profession's going to go down, and then you'll have nothing to grab on to as you want to elevate your profile. That's what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm,
What do you
I'm
think?
yeah, I'm worried that I think we're in an existential place in time. Like, I don't think we're very far off. You going into, the athletic facility, getting a blood prick, and it spits out the perfect workout and the perfect diet plan, from an AI or whatever you want to say
Yeah.
standpoint,
Yeah,
and
good point.
I don't think, I think a strength coach is typical. You kind of fall into a couple camps. I think you're either in this, I'm the master programmer and I write the best programs and nobody writes a program like I do, or I'm this master motivator and
Yeah.
I'm gonna scream and yell and cuss and get in your face and I can make you do better than what that you can do on your own. And I don't think, it goes back to what you just said, where there's really not the piece, or there's a very few that are kind of tying all the pieces together and seeing the big picture from an athletic standpoint. I think that's the area that we do as strength coaches more better than anybody. Like, I think we tie all those different departments together and able to kind of, activate that for the athlete. I think that high performance director type of role and where that's going, I think that's the future probably in a lot of ways.
I hope.
But at the same time, like, I mean, like athletes, you just look at the NFL, you look at, arbitration and CBAs and things like that. Like, they're actively reducing the number of times that they're
Right.
around.
Right.
And so, like, staffs aren't going to get bigger. Time is going to get less as college sports and even high school sports become more and more commercialized. I think we're in a really tough place that if we don't start to kind of really think about how to actively grow it and do things like put a strength coach in every high school, or
Right.
grow, the directions and have professors teaching and creating strength and conditioning programs and tying that to some AI and learning that piece, having these high performance director type of roles where you're tying all the pieces together. Like, I think we're in real trouble. And I have a hard time at this point kind of recommending a young person go in this if that's their only motivation is to train athletes.
Right. God, that's such a good point. You've always been the one able to look deeper into kind of the underpinnings of the future success, and I don't think anybody thinks that way. I know that we talked about it off camera too, that you were kind of the first one to jump out there with that CEO book, which it wasn't, strength coach, president. It was CEO. That's, you've got to look at it that way. And, as much as athletics formulates, integrity and trust and hard work ethic, it does. And I think what it does for us as strength coaches, it puts us in a role of galvanizing, being able to galvanize groups of people, and lead them, and I'm going to be talking at Northwestern and in the first part of June about that very thing, that strength and conditioning coaches, not all of them, but if you have a good profile and you're the right person, are the likely candidate, the most logical choice to be the high performance director, to be over everything that touches the athlete's performance in a holistic way, from mental to physical. In college, it would be also looking at the academics and all the other stuff, and then life after sport, and I want to stay at that school and play football there because they're going to help me afterwards, not get me to the league. Certainly that's the why for many, but we got to be prepared for those where that why is just not going to happen. I was in men's basketball in the ACC and in the Pac-10, and most of those kids think they're going to the league, and they quickly find out that that's just not the case. So now what, right? And so now you've got to be able to drive them with something better. And I think we're the ones that do that. Except, somehow somebody got it in their mind, people of little understanding, and I'm talking about higher ups, administration, front office staffs, think that the medical model, to have physicians and trainers in charge, is the only way. I'm not saying that strength coaches are the only candidates. I'm saying they're the most logical selection. I've worked with athletic trainers and PTs who run high performance programs. So don't think I'm against all that, but we're the ones leading teams out of the tunnel. We're the ones saying, coach, you need to go talk to so-and-so. We're the ones with these kids every single day. Every day we're with them, right? Not only when they're hurt, not only when they're not doing well in school, not only when they're not playing, we're with them all the time. And we see great insight into their community and who they are. And that's a big part we understand now more than ever. I mean, look, back in the day, we were the team psychologists and the nutrition and all that, right? I mean, doing the best we could. But now we know that the science, again, talking about data, science points to mental health being a big indicator of perhaps the reason why you can't make free throws or you can't make that throw to first base anymore. There's other things going on there. But you're right. I think, to aspire to a higher level, you want to be helpful and make sure you're a part of everything that they do. And I think we're the ones to do that. But other than that, I mean, I can't agree with you more that at some point you will be forced to do something other than strength and conditioning if you're not careful.
Yeah, unless we grow it, right? Unless we change it.
Right.
And define it in different than what it is defined right now. And right. I think that's the challenge, right? That's what we got to do. But I think you're spot on. I mean, with the high performance director role, I mean, in the Olympic sport countries, that position exists, and it's and it typically is a strength coach that takes on that position.
Oh, the Premier League is a perfect example.
That quite hasn't made that model really. I mean, in some ways, you could maybe argue that the associate AD that's in charge of performance might kind of fit that role here, but the position really hasn't been created. But I will say this: I mean, when it comes to group dynamics and organizational leadership and things like that, strength coach is by far the most qualified people. There's not even close.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the administrative side of running an organization, when it comes to budgeting and insurance and recruiting and contract law and all these types of things, like if you're staying in the four walls of your weight room and you think that you can go manage that, you have no shot.
Oh, I'd agree.
You have no shot. And I think that's where a lot of people think is like, oh, I'm just, like I know this because I know the athletes. Well, knowing the athletes is one thing. Going from running at maybe $100,000 budget to running a $20 million budget, that's a different story.
Right.
And so we have to grow as coaches and develop additional skills. And you've done that naturally. I've done that naturally just because we're curious people. And when we walk into a room, we don't want to be idiots, right? We want to.
Well, that's a motivator.
We want to be able to argue our opinions, but come from that, but have the information at the same time. And so you naturally kind of built that, but there's a lot of coaches that are just sitting there just kind of pointing fingers like I could do that better or I can do this. And it does. It takes, you got to have an entrepreneurial spirit. You have to have an inquisitive mind. You have to be researching things that don't necessarily make sense in the moment, but will make sense later on. And I do think that that's the path, that's a good pathway for coaches. It's coaches to take, but I think there has to be some work put in there. So kind of last question I got really is what do you think those skills are outside of what I've mentioned already? What do you think if you're listening to this podcast and you're a young coach and you're hearing two old men freaking talking about how challenging this profession is, what skills would you be working on to put yourself in a good position to kind of survive this profession 20 years from now?
Well, I would do what I did. Talk to somebody who's got a gray beard. Richard Pryor said this, you don't get old being stupid. And he said it in Richard Pryor vernacular, of course. But, that's how, what I've done my whole career is go to somebody who's already been there and do that. Success leaves clues and you want to be able to go find out what that means. And that it doesn't necessarily mean you talk to strength coaches. When I, at NC State, I stopped doing that for the very reason that the world has continued to grow. Those coaches in the room and they're watching podcasts and TikTok and everything all day long. Last thing I want them to do is listen to a strength coach. So I end up getting friends of mine, lawyers, prominent band members of, big time bands that played, people who were on teams, like a DA, who is on a team but not the leader. You know what I mean? What do you do? What do you do when you're not happy with the guy or woman who's over you? Same with the band members, like Huey Lewis and the News. I talked to their drummer. He was a season ticket holder, and we just maintained friends the whole time. What do you do when you're not the only say in your team? And what do you do when one team member wants to get bigger than another? How do you guys do that? And those things, when you're young, you probably don't conflate the two, but we know that there's so much crossover there, right? So that's why you should be reading books about outside of what we do, because there's, again, I spend a lot of time reading the Harvard Business Review and all their stuff because I think their leadership and organizational stuff is just spectacular. They do a lot of stuff from the military side. Granted, lives are in play there, but you can pull some good things out, which is what we're talking about, the high performance model. The communication is clear, the line of communication, that way it doesn't muddy the messages. And people can get hurt pretty bad when messages aren't clear in our profession. So at number one, I would get a lot of good people to pay attention to what you're doing. I would also say that, call people, call them, I mean, you can read their books. Emails are important, but we talked earlier about, what could you do? I make phone calls. I don't read, I don't email anymore. I got a good group of people that I just make phone calls. And that, to answer that question, when you want your staff development to happen, just don't have somebody come in to talk. You bring somebody in to talk about something specific, right? So how many times have we sat out in the NSCA or CCA, whatever the hell we're going, right? And you listen to somebody present, and you might grab a piece out of that in 60 minutes, but it's not, it's not dynamic. It's just a little piece. But now you could take that little piece that you got and say, we're going to talk about that for an hour.
That's right.
That's where your money gets made, right? Where you can actually get some forecasting in there and, get some financial literacy. I can honestly tell you that 10 years at UCLA, I didn't save any money, none. Now, to also be fair, back in those days, you couldn't vest unless you worked for a year. So there was my first year was part-time at $10,000 for 10 months, no benefits, no nothing. The second year was full-time, but no vesting. And then you could do something. And so I didn't even get credit for the 2 years there for my pension. But, financial literacy is a thing, right? It just happens. And I think people often think in our profession, well, what if so-and-so gets fired? And it's a little bit like Moneyball. Well, that's not the only way to lose your job. What if you Urban Meyer and say, yeah, I quit. I don't want to do this anymore, whatever. Or he goes somewhere else, she goes somewhere else, and they just can't take you. We're finding that's happening now because now GMs and presidents and athletic directors have more influence on who you bring. They've changed the way that is now. So you got to you prepare yourself for not being employed. That's the big deal. And then the only thing you'll have to deal with is lack of having a job, but not having finances in the meantime which will be your biggest worry. But I think that's about it. I think getting people that have done it and been there, and I think that goes a long ways. My mentors, were old then, but now my mentors are anywhere between 25 and 80. They all can offer me something. I think that's
Well, it's more,
important. I think there's a lot of hesitancy to reach out and seem like you don't know what the hell you're doing. I got no problems doing that.
well, I said this to somebody the other day, and it has more meaning than the way that I said it. But to me, the hardest part about being a strength coach and essentially retiring being a strength coach is dying being a strength coach. Like, it's to have this much wisdom and experience, not let that be utilized in some type of way, just seems like it cheats you as the individual, but it also cheats the organization that you're with,
Oh, 100%.
So,
Yeah.
like, I've had that conversation with our strength coach here, Jeff Eaton, who's awesome, does a great job, and his staff does a great job, but it's just like, man, I've got all this experience. So, like, just let me just dump it, and you take what you want, and what you don't want, cool, run with it, but let's have dialogue about it, and just, that way, we both want to win on Saturday, and it's been a fantastic deal. And finding those people that have been there, done it, dealt with the issues of, that's why I used to always ask in my old podcast, what's one of the biggest mistakes you made, and how you learned from it. Because my logic was always like, if I can avoid some of the mistakes that other people have made, I might be able to get there a little bit faster, and you've always done that, reached out. You've been that person for me. You're a guy that I reach out to for many, many years now, and learned from and grown from, and just challenged, like, you're not afraid to freaking challenge me, and vice versa. You need those people in your life to be the coach that you want to be, and then to be able to navigate this thing for as long as we both have. For people that want to stay up with you, kind of, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm on LinkedIn more than Twitter, but I don't even LinkedIn's a better spot if you really want to learn and share ideas. I think there's too much posturing on Twitter, and there's way more politics than ever, so I don't really spend there, but I really enjoy that. So LinkedIn's basically a place, and you can DM me there too. I offer a lot of help there, and that's probably the place where you can get me the best. But you made a good point. Somehow age is a thing here in strength and conditioning, where if you look across the workplaces in America, just anywhere you want to look, board of directors, probably average age is 70 on those board of directors. Some of the top, financial institutions and businesses in the world, because why? Because of the wisdom, because of they've been there, done that thing is an actual a meaning, there's a value to that. And if you look on the benches, in football and basketball and baseball, there's a lot of reading glasses on those benches, right? And why is that? Because they've been there and done that. So what I'd like to offer everybody is say, if you're not calling me, call somebody else, because what we have now, we have less theories, but we have examples now. So I don't have to guess. I can tell you what happens in a lot of instances. And why not, why do you want to try to do things the hard way, man? Keep from bumping your head. And I think I can help you, not in every case, but I'm sure that I can offer something.
Well, buddy, I appreciate you, man. Appreciate the friendship. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, as always, Ron, you've led the way for me too. That's for sure.